Miller Greetings engineers, there were a number of intricacies that were largely glossed over in the last Automatons walkthrough, and I wanted to start off the missile demonstration by going over some of the functions of the Automatons blocks and timers and welding. That way, when we actually make these missiles, it'll be a little less confusing about what we do. All right, set out here, I've got some test pads with blocks changing color coming out from the origin. That way we can track how much damage number of small grid warheads is going to do. These are on light armor, starting with 1 warhead. Looks like 1 warhead does a fair amount of damage. Let's check that out. The center is 2.5 meters. Each block is 2.5 meters coming out. So if we came all the way out to damage the red zone, we've traveled 2.5. 2.5 is 5, plus half of that is another 6.25 meters of damage or so. And that also penetrated down into the red zone there. Let's try on 4 warheads. On 4 warheads, we got a little into the orange zone. It's probably due to placement. However, we can see much more of the red blocks having been exposed there. That is the increased damage of the warheads, but no increased radius for them. Again, coming over to another block. This is a 3x3, only slightly increasing that range just because of the radius of the blocks laid out here. Due to the placement of those warheads, we can see that the damage is slightly pushed out, but we are seeing roughly the same exposure here, with a number of red blocks being exposed and a little bit of orange penetration in there. Moving over to 18 warheads, likely seeing the edge of the explosion there with the 6.5 meters of damage, but we should see a more thorough destruction of any block that comes in contact. Notice that here we had some residual red that was damaged, and now a greater removal of the red blocks, showing clear into the orange. No purple blocks remain on the 18. So increased warheads is increased block removal, but there is no increase in the explosion range. And here is a block of 27. "27 warheads made a large hole. This one actually got into some of the yellow range there, which is interesting. That almost necessitates another test to see if it was a fluke. So let's do it. An additional test of 27 small grid warheads. We do see some penetration through to the yellow. This is largely the same pattern we see here. Large destruction of red, some penetration into orange, and some into yellow. See if this is complete removal. It looks like it is. This block is fully intact, and I suspect the rest of these are as well. This is all deformation here, but all of these blocks are intact. Let's try one more time. Another explosion of 27 small grid warheads. We are still getting 2 spikes coming out from the sides, but not on the other 2 sides. That is curious, but we are still penetrating, for the most part, just into the orange. So we are clear through the red and into some orange removal. So that is still about the same 6.5 meters or so. So the difference between 1, 4, 9, 18, 27 warheads is merely the amount of damage. So I would say after a face of 9 warheads, you've achieved maximum damage that you're going to do. As here we are seeing penetration into orange. We can also see some penetration to orange with a mere 4 warheads, which means that may even be a desirable limit just to conserve resources. 4 warheads in a small grid missile impacting on 1 point should be sufficient for a significant amount of damage. However, 1 is enough. Let's move on to heavy armor testing. Okay, let's begin our test with the heavy armor. And again, this will be against the small grid warheads. That's what we are using our missiles for. We see a minimal explosion. We've only penetrated the singular block. That block is 2.5 meters across, so we did not even achieve the full blast radius we were achieving before on the light armor. Let's try with the 4 warheads. Four warheads was able to achieve the same effect. No further damage. Moving to a larger spread of 9 warheads. Nine warheads not achieving any further penetration. Move to a grouping of 18 warheads. Warheads able to do a little more damage. However, that might be because of the placement as well. The surrounding blocks that were not removed are disformed, and they are at full strength. 27 blocks. Small grid warhead against the heavy armor. Same effect as previous, only minor penetration, mostly just the removal of the single block that is being impacted in large deformation around it. Let's try again with the 27. Same effect. Some deformation based upon where it's placed. Here, this is not placed quite to the center, so not hitting the center of a grouping of blocks will cause more damage as you are spreading that damage across the 4 or more heavy armor blocks. So with this done, it looks like we were achieving the most that we possibly could out of a single warhead. And that was also true with the light armor. We did get more destruction of the light armor blocks as we moved through, but the penetration was largely the same. The complete removal of the black and the penetration through to the purple into the red zone. So the 6.5 meters or so that we traveled across in the radius. Let's move on to the damage reduction provided by the missile cladding itself. We've got 4 warheads and a block of light armor. These are full blocks of light armor. We'll see how much damage reduction they do to the grid. So we see full destruction of the warhead and about the same penetration into the light armor as before. So the armor of the missile would potentially have done nothing with 4 warheads. And those were full blocks, so I would expect the same or better performance out of half blocks. And we see largely the same. purple being exposed and destruction through to the red. And here we have just the armored panels. Armored panels also performing about the same, depending on where these blocks were placed in that targeting area. That targeting pad is the amount of damage that it was causing around it. We can see that the 4 warheads delivered the same amount of damage to each of these pads regardless of the light armor around it. In this example, we answer the question of, can multiple AI blocks of the same type be active on the same grid? No. In the first demonstration, I have a number of Automatons blocks on a single grid here. I'm using a small grid just because it's more compact and you can see what's going on with them. If you have multiple AI blocks with the same type, such as the flight, combat, or task blocks, they will deactivate each other so that only one will be dominant on that grid. And that's what this little demonstration does here. That's important to know if your grid has multiple blocks. Say you wanted to have a cargo drone with a task that flew during a pattern and then swapped to another pattern's task. Only one of those could be active at a time. And the cargo drone, I forced the one task off and forced another activation. And this process here shows that the deactivation of a previous block is not necessary, but is still encouraged to help with troubleshooting. Here I've got a basic task block and basic task block 2. Both of these blocks are on, however, only one of their behaviors can be on at a time. So with this task block, I will turn it on. This one is off. And if I turn number 2 on, we see that number 1 is off. Again, if I turn 1 on, 2 will become back off. And that's the same for any of these blocks of the same type. In this example, we answer, can multiple AI blocks of the same type be active on multiple subgrids? Yes. Subgrids are still grids of their own, and the behavior will not affect one another. So again, I have a couple of blocks, task 1 here and a task 1 here. We can tell they're on subgrids because their colors are different. Both of these blocks are on. And I will turn the behavior of one task on and turn the behavior of the other task on. And we can see as I flip between the two that both of these are on and both of their behavior is on. And if they were set to do something, they would. However, these ones do not. A little more complicated interaction we have here is the use of connectors and merge blocks. In this example, we answer, can multiple AI blocks of the same type be active at the same time on grids connected by a connector? Yes. And can multiple AI blocks of the same type be active at the same time on grids attached by the merge block? Yes and no. When a grid is connected to another grid with a connector, those grids are still separate, and the AI blocks will act accordingly. However, this changes when you throw merge blocks in. Adding a merge block into a grid will make 2 grids into 1 grid, and I have found that this can cause complications with the AI blocks. Some will become idle or randomly deactivated, as you cannot have the behaviors functioning simultaneously. So if you had 2 grids that had 2 combat blocks that were both active and behaving at the same time, and you merge those 2 grids together, the functions would cease to be operating as expected and more than likely will become completely disabled. Let's first start with the connectors here. You can see that these connectors are connected, and we can disconnect the one from the base in the back. We will disconnect that connector. And let's go ahead and turn off our merge blocks while we're at it. So this piece here is now a separate grid from the one over there. This one is connected via connector, and we can still access it and handle it. So let's come back into here. We'll turn our base connector back to lock. And we can see we have our two separated grids on this one device from the connector. So if we look at our task blocks, we can see that these are in fact separate grids, as they are different color than our primary grid we are accessing, which is in the white color. This task is turned on, and I can turn its behavior on. Similarly, with the second grid's task, AI on, behavior on. Flipping back between the two, we can see that the behavior is still active for the both of them, which is what we would expect when we have these subgrids attached. Moving to the merge block, we can turn this merge block back on. However, we can note that the merge blocks did not immediately rejoin, and that's because these are being maintained as separate grids by the connectors. We can go back into our block and turn off our connector, which deactivated the base connector, letting this grid float free, which allowed these merge blocks to activate. And now everything up top is one grid. Even though this connector is not connected, the other one is. And we can check that out here in the menu. We can see that on the same block, that the tasks are now all the same subgrid color. So now we have two basic tasks that are on the same subgrid. We can see that this one is on, and the second one is on. However, this will cause a conflict with the blocks, and they will not function as desired. In some cases, such as these defensive blocks, you'll see that the behavior is disabled, or you'll be seeing that it is in an idle state, even though the blocks were active from before. Normally, your combat blocks will only be able to have one active at a time, and here we can see that the behavior for both of these on the same grid are active. And this can cause some issues, where the one still says it's searching for enemies, and the other has said that it has found an enemy. This can also show up as an idle status, causing the grid not to work correctly. And that can also happen when you have multiple blocks of the same kind, both on and have their behavior on. And this is a result of the merging causing confusion within the blocks. If you do merge or unmerge grids that have AI blocks, always be sure to check your AI functions. In this example, we answer, does the order of the automaton block and the monitored block matter from the creation of the projector? No. The welding of the entire grid from a blueprint should not matter. And that is what enables us to print off an entire missile and have it function as desired repeatedly. Whereas if that were not true, we would have to reset all of the settings in our missile before we could use it. So in here, I have a series of lights that I can turn on and off, and I've got a thruster to turn on and off, and the event controller here I can turn on and off. This event controller is set to monitor the status of this door. By opening it, the event controller detects that it is open and the items can be performed. These are controlled by these two timer blocks up here to control these items as groups or individuals. Opening and closing the door is the status switch, which the event controller will detect. And even if the event controller were powered off and the state were switched, when the event controller is turned back on, it should detect the state of its monitored block, which is the door, and act appropriately. Here again, I can turn the event controller off, open the door, and when the event controller is turned back on, the status is updated for these items. You can also come around here and control these items from the cockpit, where I can turn off any individual item, or I can turn them on with the group. This is important because the individual items will be replaced with a duplicate of themselves through the blueprint when welded. The groups will be able to translate across the entirety of a grid. And in doing so, you can have an activation sequence named with symbols on your missile, which is then pasted into place and renamed, and then that same blueprint can be reused to place the missile into another position and renamed again. By changing those named groups, you're able to avoid having to set up the launch sequence of your missile repeatedly. Instead, you can do it once and rename the groups for each time it is pasted, and then update the entire grid with the new blueprint. First, we've seen that these blocks are all in place. Let's go ahead and remove them. You can see that the blueprint is showing that these items have been removed. And if we go back into the cockpit, we can see that the items are missing from our hotbar. And this will cause them not to function. The items that are still remaining still do work as normal, but the remaining items are missing. When we repair these from the blueprint, we should expect to see all of these items return. Weld complete, and we can activate our door. Now that we've replaced these blocks, we can see that the event controller is not updating correctly. As I open and close the door, the rest of the functions are not happening. We go into the cockpit. We see that it is not detecting that the items are the same. And these are the individual blocks that were on there. However, the group block of the lights does still function. And the thruster still functions because that was not changed. This is likely because of a hacking error that happens because of the number of computers in a place that needs to be updated. Some of these items have computers in them, and when you have a sufficient number removed, the items seem to break down. So if we remove this cockpit here and re-add it, we see that the items have largely returned here. And if I come back around, I now have control over the rest of these functions here. And we can go back and check on the event controller. Event controller is still not tracking, because the door is not tracking. We can come and look at what the event controller is looking at. We still see that it is able to see the door, but it is not tracking the door. And that's because of a misconfiguration that happens sometimes during the welding process. We re-add the monitoring of the door and its setup actions. It can then activate these two timers. Let's check out our timers, and we can see that even our timers do not perform their actions as they are missing an item. And the item that they are not tracking here is this thruster. We can turn this thruster off, and in the next one we can set up actions, turn the thruster on. This will turn off all the lights as a group. This will turn on each of the lights individually, showing the difference between the named and the grouped items. We can come back into the cockpit and we can see that we can activate the individual functions, but the door is still not functional. This is our door block here, and we need that to be re-added because it was the last remaining thing that had a computer. We can do an open close on it. But the event controller is still not functioning. Now, if we chop down the entire process and rebuild it, we should be able to see it function correctly. All right, with blueprint projected and the assistance of our little welding ship, we can get the entire apparatus back online. And it should function as per normal. Thruster on and off. Lights on and off. Event controller on and off. and we have activation of everything with the door. And again, I can turn off the event controller, open the door, and upon turning on the event controller, we see that everything turns on as appropriately. And even in our cockpit, we can see that all of our hotbar items have returned as well. So there can occasionally be a blueprinting error if some of the objects are removed and some remain. And if that's the case, I would recommend the destruction of the rest of the grid and replacing it anew. Otherwise, you can piecemeal and troubleshoot your items back together. This also answers the question whether a named block is the same as its predecessor or if the group bar is better. The named group will be able to translate across the printed grids, such as an activation sequence. Naming it with symbols will allow it to be easily identified, and changing that symboled name into a proper name will allow you to have individual launch sequences. Here on the alpha pad, we have several missiles that we're going through an iterative process. Here we have a nice compact 3x3 missile, which has several warheads on it. And we know we don't need that many. However, it's still nice to deliver plenty of pizzazz to your enemy. Here we can see some of the limitations of missile design and the limitations of a single welder. Most of these warheads got welded, which is fine because we don't need them all. However, we can see that these back corners are the limits of what this apparatus can achieve. So this one single welder could potentially weld 4 of these missiles being set around here. And that way you can get more use out of a single welder if you are limited on blocks, such as on those public servers. These are set up to not auto-connect, and if we wanted to refuel these tanks, which come in as set to stockpile, we will need them to be connected. We can see our Alpha Zero tanks, because we're in creative mode, they do spawn with 50% fuel. On our Alpha Zero pad, we can also set our connectors here. We can set those to lock, and that should allow our tanks to refuel. Here we can see our tanks refueling rapidly. So if this were a standard setup and we wanted this to be done, we could trigger that. The next step in the sequence should be to disconnect everything. Alpha Zero missile should be able to set up several actions. We will take our tank off of stockpile so that we can utilize the hydrogen thrusters. We will disconnect the merge block and unlock that connector so our missiles will be able to fly. We'll then turn on all of the thrusters. We will also turn off the small grid connector so that it will not reattach. On the second page of our launch sequence, we have our missiles being set up with the AI behavior turned on and the AI being turned on itself. That way, there's no possibility for these to interfere with each other. These are supposed to disconnect and then set themselves off. We also have a sensor set. As these missiles make their approach, they are set to detonate so that they can deliver a maximum impact as opposed to just colliding with the surface. We have our exhaust pipe for decor, and we also set the warheads to be on a timer and armed. Arming the warheads allows them to be destroyed on impact and to be detonated, and a timer will allow them to blow themselves up should they careen off into space and not make impact. Let's take a look at these missiles. We can see here a great example of the conflicting AI. This missile on the left was still being controlled by the AI on the right, despite being disconnected at the time. Its own internal blocks did not take over appropriately, and its behavior is set to not function correctly. So if we take a better look at it, we can see exactly what was going on. We can see that the flight behavior did not activate appropriately, nor did the offensive behavior. And that's because at the time of activation, the other missile was in control and neither of these activated in sequence. So if you have multiple missiles coming from the same launcher, you will want to make sure that your behavior is activated appropriately. We turn on the offensive behavior and the flight behavior, this missile should go off to do its job. A1 was an attempt to make the missile more flat and quickly abandoned. A2 was utilized significantly more. Here, the activation sequence will cause a Gatling gun to fire at a conveyor tube, which will then activate these missiles. These missiles will then be able to find their target separately and make impact. Going over the A2 missiles here, we can see a number of groups, and they're even separated by Missile 1 and Missile 2, but the setups should be the same for the both of them. Let's take a look at what we've got. We have our launch timers on those missiles, and we also have seekers for the missiles. For our launch timer, we'll take a look at the second missile here. We'll note that we have tanks being turned off of Stockpile so that the thrusters can be used. And then our thrusters being turned on. We have thrusters in all directions. And this also has an initial boost phase where we have one of our forward thrusters set to an override. By setting it to an override, it will launch off initially. However, the AI will not be able to control that. So when we trigger our seeker heads, we will be disabling the override thruster. And in our seeker head timer block, we disable that override thruster. We will arm our warheads, set our AI and our AI behavior on. We will arm our warheads so that they will be able to do damage either through detonation on impact or detonation on our sensor. And then we also turn on our gyro so the AI can utilize it. On our sensor, we have it set up to detonate once it gets close enough to a targeted grid. And for our range, we're making it fairly close to the missile because we don't want it to be blowing up when it's not in range. With the largest sensor range being at the quote-unquote back because these sensors are facing towards the rear of the missile. This will allow a appropriate detonation. This is something that you'll have to mess with depending on the size of your missile and the speed that it is traveling at. We have no audible proximity. We will allow it to blow up on players who are trying to hack it for whatever reason. We will not detect floating objects. We do want small ships, large ships, stations, subgrids. We do not want asteroids, and we do not want it to blow up on us or friendlies or neutrals. We only want it to detect enemies on here. By allowing us to see the sensor's range, we can see that it is a substantial range, and this lead in the front is necessary so that by the time the sensor detects a valid target and triggers its action, the missile moving at presumably 100 meters per second will have been close enough to the target to detonate. Let's hit that fire sequence. Those missiles have separated and then begin their own activation. By utilizing an event controller, they were able to detect that they were separated and then activate subsequential timers in order to trigger their behavior in a predictable manner. Here, these two missiles are on approach, and they should be set with sensors. And that was a substantially larger explosion. Not because they had more warheads on them, but because they were able to detonate and destroy their target on impact. Mostly coring out this ship, destroying its jump drive and its hydrogen tank, causing it to fall to the ground. These missiles are easy to weld up as well. We can reactivate the projector, showing both of the missiles, and then hitting the weld button to get it all back set up, and then turning off the welder. Otherwise, detaching the missiles will be difficult. With this setup, the missiles are automatically piped, and you don't have to worry about fiddling with merge blocks or connectors, so these are very repeatable missiles if you put them on a larger craft. We can fire these same missiles again. 2 quick shots, and the missiles are away. This kind of shows how even small changes in your craft's direction can cause massive changes in a missile's velocity. Moving on to our A3 missile, we expanded back out to occupy the 3x3 grid and still utilizing 2x2 for compactness. And this is mostly so that we don't have to worry about blocks that would be merging towards others. Thrusters will not merge to other blocks on the side where the thrust comes out. However, they can merge from all the other sides. This can make placing your missiles in a compact location more difficult. These are the missiles that are utilized on the little Raptor that I have over here. Being placed as such, these grids will be able to detach and not blow up themselves because they will not be attached to this grid or each other, allowing for a successful separation. Only one thruster on these, which means there is no initial boost phase. Launching from the aircraft, it will not actually need the initial boost phase, so it will fall for a brief moment before activating its thrusters and surging towards the target. A4 missile is not a design of my own. This is from another creator, NG. He has some amazing works on the workshop. I wanted to see how my items were doing in comparison to his, so I pulled apart one of his missiles to see how it works. We can see it's a very simple setup with thrusters in all directions, has one hydrogen tank, and only one warhead on top. Does have a couple of vent controllers for it to detect it being fueled, and this also utilizes a Gatling gun to separate 2 missiles, as is the original over here. This missile set comes from NG's Hammerhead from Star Citizen. Go check that one out if you want to see how these missiles work. Very similar to mine, however they are a much more elegant weapon for a more civilized time. Next, over at the A5, I tried auto launch sequences that were easily repeatable using some of the earlier grid designs. This blockish design should be able to rebuild, connect, refuel, and launch a missile. Instead of using event controllers to do all of those actions, timers seem to be more reliable and more repeatable. We can give that a go in this demonstration here. We'll set our missile off to go. Here we can see it's being instantly rebuilt. It should be refueled by virtue of the tank being set to stockpile, and we can see the base side connector connecting to the missile. After a brief time for the tank to refuel and the welding to complete, the sequence to fire will activate, and that will cause the missile to launch away and seek its target. I've stopped the missile auto launch right after it's fired its last missile, so we can see the sequence of events that happen for it. Currently, our merge block and our connector for the base are off. So let's see what's going to happen next in this sequence here. In our base auto launch timer set, we have some timers which will trigger. In order to stop the base auto launch, you can select these triggers and tell them to stop in order to do maintenance or adjust any future items on there. First thing that we'll need to do is reset. We've already launched, so we need to do a reset on our launcher. We can check the items that we have here. Our merge block would be turned back on. Our connector needs to be turned back on, and we will also turn on an auto connect event controller. Once we turn the merge block back on, we will have a base for our blueprint to be welded to. Once our connector is welded, the event controller on the base will be able to detect that it is ready to lock, and our base will automatically lock to our missile. It will then begin the sequence for the reset phase 2. In an earlier example, we mentioned how we did not want to use event controllers to monitor every item in the process. That's because of a number of anomalies that go on with the proper blocks being represented throughout the grid once they are rewelded. By using this event controller on the base side, we don't have to worry about it being removed, and we're only detecting a block that is never removed, which is the base connector. We will turn off this event controller because as soon as this missile launches, it will try to reconnect to the missile, and we do not want our base attempting to connect to a live missile. Then we will begin the fire sequence of our missile. The base fire sequence will allow us to disconnect the base connector and then turn it off, which will prevent the missile from attempting to reconnect. Turning off our merge block will make the missile an entirely separate grid. Then we're able to trigger the group for the base reset timer 1 to restart the process. Reactivating the base's merge block and connector allows for the grid to be rewelded, and then we can take a look at the missile. On the missile itself, we have a launch and a seeker sequence, and we can check out what was going on here. Again, we've got the tank being turned off of stockpile, the connector unlocking and turning off, the merge block turning off, and the thruster override being set on this missile. We also have the seeker head set up on the next iteration. Additionally, we have the exhaust being turned on and the rest of the thrusters being turned on. So not only do we have our override sending it upwards, we have the rest of the thrusters to support it in any orientation. Moving on to the A5 seeker head, we turn off the thrust override and turn the AI blocks on and their behavior on so that they can navigate the missile. We also turn on the gyroscope, the sensors, arm the warheads, and begin their countdown sequence or self-destruct. For our sensor, we will also turn that on and have a similar setup for the missile detection range with similar setups onto what we want it to detonate on. Moving over to our Capstone missile, again, I wanted a more narrow-looking missile profile that still had thrust in all the directions and a decent delivery package. So I went back and made this missile here. This missile is going to be connected with a merge block and a connector, and still has many of the same features as the previous warheads. Let's take a look at it real fast. This missile is appropriately named with symbols in the groups so that the groups can be triggered for each missile. By applying this missile through copying, pasting, or projecting onto a new grid, the groups from this missile can be easily identified, as can all of its constituent components, and then be renamed appropriately for greater troubleshooting capabilities. We can see our hydrogen tank is on stockpile by default, and that way it would allow it to refuel. Let's take a look at our launch timer. We don't need a group for the seeker head, only the launch timer, and that is what this symbol signifies. This is created by the game for the group. The launch timer itself has more redundancies in here because I kept messing up the sequences, so I tried to idiot-proof for myself. By turning the battery on and then to auto, we will ensure that the missile will be able to sustain itself in case it was turned off. By turning the battery on and set to auto, we can ensure that the missile is able to sustain itself in case we clumsily turned off all batteries on our grid before disconnecting the missile. We also turn our hydrogen tank on and our stockpile off, just in case we had messed with our tank configuration during troubleshooting. We have a forward override thruster turned on, an exhaust turned on, and then similarly with our connectors, we will unlock and power down our connector. We will not need this missile back. We will also toggle off the merge block, which should signify a full separation from our previous grid. We also have the rest of the additional thruster directions turned on so that the override thruster can propel the missile without it falling out of the sky. We then begin the seeker head timer block. This missile also has the launch sequence for the AI blocks on this timer block. It is also on the seeker head where it should have operated fine. However, it was not triggering successfully, and placing the AI controls on this block will. Each of these AI blocks is set specifically to this missile, so it should not interfere with other missiles. After a short delay, we will have several actions happen on the seeker head timer block. This will deactivate our forward override thruster and again reinitiate the AI sequence should it have failed previously. Turning on the gyro will allow the AI to pilot the missile, as well as arming and setting the timer for the warheads. Should they fail to reach its destination, this warhead detonation should explode the missile and allow us to regain our PCU. We can also turn on the sensor, and the sensor has similar limits set for it, with this back area extending to the front of the missile, given the orientation of the sensor here. And again, set up actions to detonate the warheads. The warheads on this missile being just the few at the front here, but as our testing shows, we don't need more than a few warheads in order to cause a splash. That is the same missile that was placed on this launching truck here. This is a crewed rig that is able to support 4 of these missiles, which it does very well. By having the launch sequence set into the groups, we are able to fire them individually. Each of these is a group down here. So whenever these are fired, the blueprint for the projector for just the subgrid is allowing these missiles to be rebuilt and refired. For our drones, we're just getting started over here. We have a craft with several fuel tanks in it and a couple of Gatling guns. This can be set to a circular pattern or a hit and run pattern. It can also be armed with warheads and a sensor should you wish to send it on a one-way collision. At that point, it's a missile and is probably not worth doing if you're going to utilize this as a harassing attack drone. Circular pattern is probably better. All of that exposition was long-winded, but ultimately essential to the function that we are trying to achieve here and in our other projects. So next time we'll get to something a little more exciting, actual testing of these missiles versus various platforms. Until next time, go forth and build great things. See you then.